Assalamu alaikum, everyone. We're back with another podcast, and we are joined today by Muhammad Jalal from the Thinking Muslim. So it's we're interviewing a podcaster, and I think for a lot of people, and we were speaking about this earlier as well, that Jalal Bhai is limited to the guests, yani, in the sense of we don't know who Jalal Bhai is, and I've gotten to know him a little bit, alhamdulillah, and he's an author. He writes for publications both professionally and as well as for activism reasons. He's somebody who has a master's level degree in international relations and is an educator, especially for political affairs and the like. But we all know him and love him for the Thinking Muslim podcast. Jalal Bhai is an Indian Muslim, born and bred, right, in the UK.
Absolutely,
right.
Yes.
So you're second generation. Sadly. Then?
Yes.
All right, Jalal Bhai, how are you doing?
Alhamdulillah, it's really great. An honor to be with you, actually, Aman Bhai. It's really lovely that you've reached out to me, and Jazakallah khair. Thank you very much for your very kind introduction.
No, I think I didn't do justice to all the work that you've been doing, mashallah, and you were one of the reasons why we started the podcast in English, because we primarily do it in Urdu. But we saw it and we realized that a lot of the activism and a lot of the work that needs to be done is in English. So it's a smaller effort compared to the Thinking Muslim effort, because we're a bit inconsistent with our uploading schedule. But inshallah, we will be more consistent and work harder. So there's a lot to unpack. It's been a year of violence. It's been a year of grief. But also a year, I think, of profound victories, in a sense that we've not seen before. The weirdest thing I think about this year is the voyeuristic element. It's one of those wars compared to the Iraq war, which is something I grew up with and you grew up with, which the voyeurism was delayed. It wasn't so immediate. The access was not so it wasn't so fickle in the way that we access the Gaza conflict with our phones, with our computers, with the internet in general. What do you think has been the role of the media, especially Western media, where you are based out of, that is London, in the conflict? And what would you like to have seen with Western media?
Aman Bhai, have you ever watched the film Hunger Games? These 3 films.
I'm aware of them, yes.
You're aware of that, right? It was originally written by an author, Suzanne Collins. And in 2003, Miss Collins was walking by, I think, a store in New York or wherever she lives. And she saw 2 screens. One screen was the invasion of Iraq, the bombing, the shock and awe that we all witnessed of Iraq and the so-called liberation of Iraqis by the US military. And on the other screen, you had a reality TV show at the same time. And she saw this split screen, the Iraq war on the one side, this dehumanization of Arabs, this bombing of Baghdad, this so-called liberation of yet another Muslim country. And then on the other side, you had, a reality TV show. And it made her start to think about the world in which she resided. Because she was watching on the television screens, just the humdrum of life, the reality TV shows, the fakery, maybe, the shallowness of popular culture, and how that had consumed the people of America. Yet at the same time, the American military was halfway around the world committing all sorts of horrors. As we learn later, 1 million people died as a result of the invasion of Iraq in one form or the other. And it began to raise a question in her mind about just how death and destruction had become so normalized. And I think that's a good segue into your question that you ask. And your question is really how the Western media dehumanizes, or how the Western media has reacted to Gaza. And it's exactly that. What we have on our TV screens is we have this normalization of life. We have this frivolity. We have this superficiality of life. And everyone I see around me just gets on with life. It's the normal routine of life and the way in which life continues. And then once in a while, it's punctuated with the horrors we see in Gaza. But those horrors we see in Gaza are so minor in their life schedule, so minor in the way they perceive their daily life, but it just becomes one of those things on the sideline. It's like a small blip on what is really their ordinary schedules of their ordinary lives. And that's actually how the Western media work. They don't deny what is happening in Gaza, because denying it would push people to question it, right? So you see it from time to time. You will see it on a news program. You will see it yesterday, for example. We were all surprised to see on Fox News, we had a Fox journalist talk about the horrors of Gaza and how journalists are targeted. And our initial reaction is to say, wow, look, even Fox News, a right-wing, pro-Zionist organization, is talking about Gaza, right? But it's the mastery of the West. The mastery of the West is you talk about it, but you make it insignificant. It becomes just one of those small things that we should be concerned with. But actually, life and the superficialities of life are far more important to us. And that's a mindset. The Western media has done this. You know, in Arab societies, we called that propaganda. We call that a means by which, you know, George Orwell talked about this, you know, a means by which you brainwash the population. But it's very sophisticated here in the West. In fact, we're not immune to that. You know, I can come across Muslims, Pakistanis, right? You know, our fellow brothers and sisters who were very exercised by what happened in Gaza at the very beginning stages. But now they feel less inclined to even care about it, such that if you're in conversation with them, it doesn't appear. Yet there is a genocide taking place. You know, it is the worst genocide we have witnessed in a generation or two. It is on our TV screens, but we are taught, actually we are propagated. It is a subtle way by which our minds are managed. We are taught to not care anymore. And just one last point to make here. It's not a coincidence. I mean, this is not a situation that has come about through some form of chance. It's a situation that has been very carefully crafted by the West, and we are all subject to that regime. In fact, it's not just Westerners. You guys are. All of the Muslim world is subject, because of the powers of globalization, are subject to this propaganda which we get day in and day out from the mainstream press.
No, I think it was very beautifully put. That was a very horrifying example, by the way, the Hunger Games one. I had no idea that's how she conceived of the... Because the story, for the audience who's not aware of it, the Hunger Games, the premise was that there is a reality TV show where young people compete for their own districts or their own communities to be able to feed them for the annual year, and they fight to the death or something. So the idea was that the duality of a Western style media of showing the absolute violence of the Iraq war, but always to minimize the blow of the impact, and to create an environment around which the entertainment aspect is heavy and the educational aspect is lighter. And the other impact is that they want to dehumanize the target and I remember that a lot of the caricatures they used to make of Arab men and Muslim men or brown men in general at the time of the peak of the war on terror, by dehumanizing the characters of these individuals, any fighters from the Taliban even, or they would make this sort of caricature of a man in a turban and this goofy sort of to help dehumanize the population that was being slaughtered. At the same time, there's been a new aspect that we've seen, and it's not that it wasn't there, Jalal bhai. It's just that I think people have become aware to it now, is the idea of pushing fake news long enough so that to provide cover for certain military operations that are taking place. For the time being, if people are busy engaging with the propaganda or deconstructing the propaganda, the Israeli state in this case would have already done what it needed to do and move on. And as a cover, you saw a lot of propaganda being used to create a smokescreen for military operations in Gaza, in the Western Bank. And although all of this stuff was done before in Iraq as well, but I think the the internet has come to its full maturity now, and the user base is also fully aware, and there's enough freedom online, I think, that we're able to challenge this. That's the media narrative. Did you find that this, as a Western person, as a Westerner, as somebody who resides in the West, has grown up as a Western individual, did you find yourself questioning or challenging the ideas of the West itself? Did you find yourself comfortable as a Westerner? Do you still comfortable with identifying as a British Muslim or a British Indian? Do you know what I mean? Isn't it a strange thing to grow up with one aspect of the UK, which is definitely honorable and dignified, the idea of a multicultural society, but at the same time, have you seen a lot of people around you questioning very basic notions about what it is to be Western?
Yeah, actually, I find it very jarring when you use the term Westerner or Western Muslim or as a Westerner. I find those terms quite jarring because, of course, even prior to the Gaza conflict, I feel that European Muslims, but in particular British Muslims, have always found it very difficult to exactly identify with Britishness or Europeanness because, of course, those labels are identified with colonialism. They're connected to colonialism. They're connected to a history, in particular for Muslims who came from the Indian subcontinent, a history which is very blooded, a history which continued or which predated this dehumanization, but continued or echoed this policy of dehumanization within its colonial mindset. So in many ways, we have grown up here in the UK not actually believing that we are part and parcel of this identity they would like to sell to us. And then the war on terror comes along, of course, and the war on terror confirms to us that we are second class. I mean, you may know the story of Shabina Begum here in the UK. She's a Bangladeshi, a young lady, 15 years old, who was duped into joining ISIS and move into Syria. And it was very easy for the British state to take away her passport. And in fact, it was a so-called Muslim Home Secretary at the time who took away her passport. And Sajid Javid. And Sajid Javid, he's of Pakistani origin. SubhanAllah, he doesn't have any claims to be of a Muslim, I'll be honest with you. He very readily admits that he's moved away from Islam. But Sajid Javid, who claims, at least from an identity perspective, that he's a Muslim, he made a point in saying that, we're not going to tolerate these people who reject our society and our culture. And so the crime of Shabina Begum, who was 15 years old, Shamima Begum, who was 15 years old, was not, by the way, that she had joined ISIS. The crime of Shamima Begum is that she had departed from the pre-packaged identity that they had served us and told us that we had to believe, right? And so he wanted to send a signal to second and third generation Muslims that you may have been born here, but you will be treated as a second-class citizen as long as you make Islam or your Muslimness or your national identity beyond Britain, you make those identities supersede the pre-packaged identity we want to give to you, which is that of Britishness. So I think that we have been going through this logic of questioning who we really are for a very long period of time. And that's why, by the way, just as a sub point, the idea of hijrah and moving away from these countries is a very big theme. Now, I suspect you guys in Pakistan will probably laugh at us for this realization, right? But there is a feeling amongst second and third generation. By the way, it's very dominant amongst young Muslims. You speak to under 25-year-olds in Britain, and there is this overarching feeling that we don't really feel this country is any longer our home, and we have to try to find a home elsewhere. Now, okay, again, there is a lot to laugh about because there are romanticized notions of what it means to move back to a Muslim country. And so a lot of people, they go to Lahore thinking that they're going to live, this romanticized life. And then they realize that, okay, fine, but there's load shedding. And it's not that easy, by the way, to move back when you've lived in the so-called luxurious West. But there is this feeling. But to come to your question, Gaza has really been an open wound because you had, until Gaza, you had Muslims who were under this pretension that the West still loved Islam, or the West still had an open, embrace towards Muslims and towards the Muslim world, because we were fooled into believing that. But Gaza has opened up a real wound, because we can see this dislocation, we can see this dissonance on a daily basis. Just the other day, 7th of October came and went, and Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, of course, of the UK, he gave a special address in the House of Commons. And in that address, he spoke about Israel and spoke about the horrors of what happened on the 7th of October, and how we owe so much to the resilience of the Jewish community in Britain and to the Jewish community abroad. Yet he failed to even discuss and mark and express his dissatisfaction with what has happened since, which is the death of over 160,000, according to the British journal Lancet, the very eminent British journal Lancet, the death of the killing of 160,000 Gazans, right? And so it's that type of dissonance we see in these Western societies, where the Western politicians are not even ready to accept they have aided and abetted a genocide that makes us feel less at home in these countries, and less at home with the idea that we would ever be treated with that. And just to give you one last example, I was watching a briefing in Washington. The press briefings that I had that they have every day. And I can't remember the name now of the person who was conducting the briefing, but the question was asked by a Muslim journalist that on the 7th of October, they marked all of the American Jews who passed away, who died as a result of the actions of Hamas, or the actions of the Israeli state, which we don't need to go into, but they marked the death of these individuals. And she asked, well, why didn't you mark the death of American Palestinians who had died since then? Do you believe that American Palestinians are second-class citizens? And he gave a very problematic answer, but it's very clear that Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, Muslim Brits. His answer was that, it was really a mark of the 7th of October, and we were commemorating what happened on 7th of October, and that's why we focused on that. But actually, by the way, it was a fake answer, because, of course, on the death of the killing of Aisha Noor, who is an American, dual American Turkish citizen, who had been killed in cold blood in the West Bank as an observer. The American state did not even respond to her family's pleas to meet them, and have not actually said anything sizable about her death, except that they accept the Israeli narrative. So there is a dual citizenship. There's a dual class citizenship. And you just have to know that. You travel through, if a American Muslim or a British Muslim travels through any of these airports, they know how they're treated. As you know, since 9/11, we've got this phenomenon here in Britain called flying whilst Muslim. It used to be driving whilst black, right? So if you were black in Britain, you drove a BMW, you get stopped many times, right? Now it's flying whilst Muslim. It doesn't matter who you are and what your professed religious affiliations are. If you travel through airports, it is very likely that you'll be stopped because you're seen to be
that's my experience of it. I mean, I remember when I came to the UK the first time, I think I was 12 or 13, and I noticed that Germans could enter and exit. Yani the literal granddaughters and grandsons of Nazis could, but my grandfather, who had fought for the British Empire in East Asia, in the in what you would call the East Indies in Myanmar, but against the Japanese, we could not. We had to fill out cartoonish visa forms, and I mean, this is neither here nor there. I mean, you started with the example of Shamima Begum, and I think it's really funny. You should know this, that we spoke about the media earlier and how effective it can be even in propagandizing Muslims who are not in the West. I had a full-blown debate that turned into a fight almost with a Pakistani podcaster. He's a friend of ours, but he's a liberal. and he was convinced that there was no such case. And I told him that Canadian intelligence was involved in beguiling this young girl, and her only crime was that she fell for an intelligence trap, which one would assume that if you have billions of dollars behind you to create social scenarios to entrap young people, it'll work. Yani, in essence, in a court of law, in any sort of just court of law, it would be considered a case of entrapment as opposed to a case of terrorism or departing from British values or whatever. This Pakistani podcaster was convinced that I'm telling him some kind of wacky conspiracy theory. He was convinced.
Yeah.
And he refused to check it online. I said, listen, it's public information that Canadian intelligence beguiled this young woman, and an underage woman, by the way. When when talking about Muslims, there's always this question of women and ages of consent, but now all of a sudden that's gone. Like when it comes to sexuality with Islam and Muslims, it's always about women and age of consent. But then all of a sudden, when it's about departing from Western values or British values or becoming a terrorist, we can be of any age. We're fighting age males and females, which is 12.
Of course.
Which is 12 now. So with sexuality, it's 18 or 21 arbitrarily. But with war, it's always 12 or 10 or however the goalpost has been shifted. So this Shamima Begum case, I think, is iconic, and I think it's a less controversial one, but I think a more controversial one for the Americans was Anwar al-Awlaki. And even if he was a convicted terrorist, the argument is, can the government circumvent the judicial processes and call hit orders, execution orders, assassinations on its own citizens, and because
and on his children,
and on his children, and on his children, and I think one of his nephews, I think, and I think that because these people, and I always, whenever I meet Westerners, especially the whites, love them, but especially when I meet them, I always tell them that you guys dropped the ball like 30, 40 years ago. Which it's a little too late now with all the noticing and the realizing that they're doing. So I mean, we've seen how the West has. It was a false promise, I think, and people from South Asia, people from Turkey, people from Iraq and the Gulf and all over the Muslim world went there in the 50s and the 60s. Your parents went in the 70s and 80s, I'm assuming.
Yeah, 70s, yeah.
MashaAllah. I mean, a lot of my relatives went there as well at the same time, and they made what is Bradford and Slough and the like, the way they are now. But the 70s and 80s are a marked, era when a lot of, brown or Muslim communities shifted to the UK with the promise of a multicultural society, and I think it failed, and now you mentioned that a lot of young people are migrating back. I've met some of them, by the way.
In Islamabad, mostly.
Islamabad, they love Islamabad, by the way. It's because of the weather. It's because of the weather. You're right.
Yes.
I asked myself, Karachi is too chaotic, I think, for them, and Lahore is too hot, so it's always Islamabad. Yes. And because a lot of them, because they're from that North Punjab belt, their villages are nearby, so they can always, go to and fro from the villages. And Islamabad doesn't lose any electricity in a majority of areas. Being the capital.
It's the electricity. Let's face it. It's the electricity.
It's also the weather. It's less hot. So, I mean, I've seen some of these communities, and I can say that it's a bit romanticized in their heads, but I can understand and I can sympathize with the sentiment. I can respect it. So, and I think it can be shuffling of the guard as well, like a changing of the guard that, Pakistanis leave and then expats come back, and then we can keep, that's a joke. That's a joke. We don't want the cycle to repeat. And then they can become PTI supporters, and then they can come back and until we've achieved absolute, a uniform sort of lifestyle across the board in Pakistan. No, I'm sorry I apologize to the audience for this segment, but when brown people, when we get together, this is what we talk about.
We can make Lahore Bradford.
Listen, I mean, there's a lot worse things you could do to Lahore. I mean, chicken shops for everyone. Khair, not to get too off track. I mean, it's. I told you, we started the English podcast after seeing The Thinking Muslim. So this for me is a bit. It's more about me chit chatting with you than it being a serious podcast. But we have to get back to the. So I mean, Western Muslims are reconsidering their position. This is what we can say. Whether or not they're willing to migrate or not, it's a separate debate. But they're reconsidering their position in the sort of in the hierarchy of the Western sort of civil society in that world where they are as citizens. Do you think that Muslims in the West, some of them, at least a sizable minority of them, have also accepted this very strange Western Muslim exceptionalism narrative? Yeah. Like, have you noticed this? I think it's more to do with American Islam, but you can also, in American and Canadian Islam, but you also see it somewhat in the UK about this, that they have an exceptional status either inside or outside the Ummah as a separate entity altogether. And a lot of their ideas are then superimposed on the rest of the Ummah. How do you see the interplay? I mean, in the UK it's different, obviously, because the ethnic ties are very strong. But with America, it's a bit different. And I'm sure you have an experience of both societies.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And we see that more prominently, as you said, with American Muslims, but we see it here in Europe. I think in many European countries, of course, the level of discrimination, the level of marginalization forces Muslims to take a stance and to find themselves or to self-describe themselves to be more connected to the Muslim Ummah or to their country of origin rather than the country within which they live. So, for example, in France, you'd find it very difficult to find Muslims who feel that France is in any way exceptional. And as I said to you before, with Britain, our connection with the Indian subcontinent largely, but also the horrors of the British Empire has kept us away from fully digesting or fully believing in the sort of British identity. But I think it's different in America. And I've had lots of conversations with American Muslims to know that when you're in the heart of the empire, and that's what it is, right? Where Britain is pretty much on the peripheries of the empire. We serve the empire here in Britain. But the empire's core is going to produce a certain type of mentality of those people who migrate to it, or those people who find themselves lucky enough to have been born into that country, and lucky enough in inverted commas, of course. And so the United States is this global empire, and those citizens within it feel a sense of privilege. They feel they're part of this global enterprise. And so it's not odd to see that they embrace that empire exceptionalism. They swallow that pill and they believe that there is something special about being Muslim and being American. And I noticed that, and I think Gaza has in a way dented that identity and caused them to challenge their preconceived notions of what it means to be an American Muslim and those second-class status that we spoke about earlier. But it still exists and it still persists. And we see that actually even amongst Islamic preachers and amongst Muslims who are involved in Islamic activity, that they somehow see themselves as the center of the Muslim world. And actually we see that as well. I was speaking to a Malaysian Muslim and I asked him, who are your really important Islamic figures? Like, who do you look up to? And the first top 5 names he presented to me were American Muslim preachers, American Muslim sheikhs, right? And that tells us something about how we conceive the notion of America, not just in general popular culture, but also how that is seeped into our Islamic understandings, and I think that's a problem in a way, but it's a bigger problem when we think about American Muslims and British Muslims and how the tentacles of the American empire, of course, reach out to the Muslim world, and America has caused all sorts of let's call them challenges, but of course it's deeper than challenges, but has caused all sorts of challenges, but just not Pakistan and the Middle East, but all Muslim countries, right? Economically and militarily, and politically, America has created the chaos that we see today playing out across the Muslim world, and has fostered these cartoonic regimes and these cartoonic states that today litter the Muslim world, right? And so we can't separate the mess the Muslim world finds itself in and just the tentacles of this empire. And I think there needs to be a growing up moment for Muslims in the West. They need to shed this American and British exceptionalism that they believe that just because of a quirk of fate, that somehow they have a superiority. But more importantly, they need to begin to question and challenge the very premise of this American hegemony. And they need to be at the forefront of commenting, and I'm not saying in a subversive way, that's not my point, but actually commenting and pointing out that Gaza, for example, is a consequence of the American empire. Gaza and Israel is actually part of this American empire. It's a colony. Israel is a colony of this American empire. And the settler colonial project is part of the American foreign policy project. It's part of the international relations of America in the Middle East and how it connects with the Middle East. It has implanted this parasitic state, and that's what it is, within the heart of the Middle East, in order to control this very important central terrain. And so, I think Muslims in the West have to push back. And I'm not saying, as I went to, the last time I said this on Dilly Hussein's show, all hell broke loose in America. And, there are American Muslims who said that, look at this guy, he wants us to become the Trojan horse in the West. And it's far from it. I'm actually saying that at the moment, the left are doing a really good job in challenging Western hegemony. But that narrative comes from a very Marxian perspective. I think Muslims need to do that because we have a greater claim to justice, and we have an ideology, for want of a better term. We have a deen which calls us, which pushes us. A worldview. It's a very good word. A worldview that tells us that justice is at the heart of our Islam. And so why do we feel privileged enough to be silenced when it comes to the crimes of the countries within which we reside?
Jalal bhai, I think that was really fascinating, and I don't think it's an ideological problem that the American Muslims are facing. It's a psychological one, and I think you identified that perfectly. That even in their critique of your statement, for example, there is an implicit. So, because you are asking them to challenge Western hegemony, they themselves are so propagandized that they think challenging hegemony and being disloyal to America is a different. They think these are one and the same. Whereas you see that the left in America is loyal to America and it wants America to improve and change. So they're also buying into the propaganda. They're lost in the sauce, the Western Muslim, because they're not realizing that they too can critique the way their state is operating and the direction that their country is taking, that is America or Canada in this case, but from the paradigm of Islam. And it is perfectly... And I think this is where the inferior sort of psychology that they're unfortunately involved with it comes into play, where they don't see Islam as a solution to the problems of the West. They don't see it being presented as an alternative form of justice, as a worldview in competition with what you have in mainstream American politics. And this is what I mean, I have to ask you. I think we're very well, and it's not a perverted sort of, I think you said it appropriately, as a Trojan horse or as a subversive tactic to somehow demoralize the West or make them weak in their position. But the idea is to, as Western citizens, what options do we have politically and socially? And now in Europe especially, I think the waking up moment happened, I think 20, 30 years ago, because you guys were more entrenched generationally, economically. In America, the communities are very disparate, far apart, and also I think the physical proximity to the Muslim world it creates this problem of you only come back from America once a year, as opposed to with the UK or somewhere where you have regular contact with the Muslim world.
Yeah.
What do you think the options are politically? Because just the idea of, and this is where I'll play devil's advocate for the American Muslims, just the idea of having an alternative third option, they've seen the Green Party. They've seen how poorly these things fail. Yani, for them, as such a small minority with no influence, don't you think it's a bit unfair because European Muslims have more options compared to the Americans? And what are those options for either party?
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating conversation to have. And it just so happens today I've published an article in Muslim Matters about the American election. And alhamdulillah, there's been a really rigorous conversation through my podcast, but also through other platforms, a rigorous conversation about the fate of Muslims in this coming election. Because as you know, the 5th of November, there is a US elections, and that's going to decide a lot about how Muslims in particular should think about their position in their political position in American society. Just to take a step back, let me give you a glimpse of what we managed to achieve here in the UK. As you know, in July, we had a general election. So we had, the regular elections that take place. We had election for the Prime Minister and the composition of the House of Commons. And prior to that election, majority of Muslims here, who, as you know, are from the Indian subcontinent, the majority of Muslims voted Labour. Because for many decades, Labour had championed in multiculturalism, championed the cause of Kashmir, maybe, although that's less so today, have championed some of the issues, the touchstone issues that the Muslim community, racism and these issues that Muslim community have been blighted by, and they found a home in the sort of centre-left party of Labour. So 80-odd% of Muslims in Britain supported Labour. And then the genocide of Gaza began, and Labour, who were then in opposition, they supported Israel at every stage of its genocide. And they denied a voice for the Muslims and denied a voice for Palestinians. In fact, it got to a point where a Pakistani Muslim who stood for election, Faiza Shaheen, she was removed at a very later stage. She was deselected by the party because she had liked a tweet. It wasn't even a statement. By the way, she had been very careful to not comment about Palestine, but she had liked a tweet on Palestine, which was misconstrued as anti-Semitic. I mean, it's amazing, right? So she was deselected and taken off. And in her place, a more pliable non-Muslim candidate was selected. And so we had a situation here in Britain where it was very obvious that unless Muslims came together as a bloc, we would once again be duped by the two-party system, the Conservative and Labour parties, and we would find ourselves to vote for a party that had not only marginalised us in the election, but actually had rubber-stamped a genocide. And so we started a Muslim vote campaign here. We brought the Muslim community together. And it was phenomenal in its success. In fact, it was so successful that we, for the first time ever, we had 4 independent MPs who had managed to buck every trend. Since the Second World War, only 3 independents had ever been elected in a competitive election since 1945. We managed to get 4 in one election. Every single commentator across the country said this was impossible. And by the way, the 4 who were elected on the GULZAR vote. And so, and not only that, on top of that, 6 or 7 narrowly missed. One such person is Lian Mohammed, who is a Palestinian activist, and she was going to cause the greatest upset of the night. She lost by 500 votes. If 200 people switched votes from the Labour Party to her, she would have been elected and to Parliament, and she would have deposed one of the most important, the second in line for the Labour leadership. She would have, a guy called Wes Streeton, she would have deposed him. I mean, I was there on the count on the night, and I saw Wes Streeton sweat as they were counting the votes because it was so close, wafer thin, right? And the next day, the news was of a Labour landslide. The Labour Party won an amazing, outstanding landslide, but it was also the Gaza vote really mattered. And so we put Gaza on the map in that election. And so now, if we move to the American election, sorry for the very long explanation, but the American elections, I believe that the American Muslims have a chance to do that. Not only because, yes, of course, the American Muslims have a slightly more narrow ability to influence politics than, say, what we have here. As you quite rightly say, Bradford could easily be Bradfordistan, because, of course, we have over 50% Muslims in Bradford, right? So we can really impact the election. In Pennsylvania or in Michigan, our percentages are 3% at the most in both states. However, in an election where these swing states, there are around 7 swing states in America, 3 or 4 of these swing states have very concentrated Muslim communities. If you go to Michigan, Detroit, Dearborn, are very concentrated Arab Muslim communities. Go to Pennsylvania, go to Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia. You find that you've got Muslim communities who may be insignificant in most elections, but in this election, because they configure, they have a percentage which is greater than the polling suggests, between the main political parties, Republican and Democrats, they can have a decisive impact upon the election. And so we find ourselves as Muslims in a position where we can punish Kamala Harris for her genocide. Her administration, the Biden-Harris administration, has signed up to the most horrific genocide. Now, of course, you've got, again, I'm sorry to say this, but Pakistani Muslims like Mehdi Hassan, who claim that the only alternative is to vote for this genocider. I've had a conversation with Mehdi. I respect Mehdi's work, but I've had a conversation with him where I've said to him, this is a ludicrous position to hold, because, of course, by calling Americans and Muslims to vote for Harris, you're effectively saying that you can get away with voting for genocide. Alhamdulillah, there was a good friend of mine, Osman Omarji, who from the Yaqeen Institute, who has conducted a really extensive survey, and he concluded that American Muslims, over a plurality of American Muslims now, are ready to vote against the two-party system.
Jill Stein, then?
And to bank their vote in the Green Party or to whoever. Now, by the way, where they bank their vote doesn't really matter. Okay, the Green Party may only get 3 or 4% of the popular vote. It's not the issue. And by the way, the Green Party may even hold some problematic views. For us, that's not the issue. It's about banking your vote in a political party such that on the day of the election, on the night of the election, you can endorse a narrative which suggests that a Muslim community has come behind the Muslims of Gaza, rather than voted for the 2 mainstream political parties. So I think we've got to think deeply about the narrative on election night. If we can cut through this by placing our vote in one of the third parties, we can change that narrative. Kamala Harris, let me spell that out. Harris lost the election because Muslims voted for a third party sufficiently enough in the swing states that Gaza really registered in this election. The election was a Gaza election, and that's why Harris lost the election. I think that's a compelling argument.
No, I think that's a solid case. The argument basically is that the US, they can leverage their numbers in a way where they might not be able to get candidates elected, but they will be definitely seen as a demographic worth pandering to by the mainstream politicians, because they can help in making candidates lose, which is a flip of the. I think it's a very fascinating position to hold, and inshallah, I hope that the American Muslims will take heed. I think Mehdi's positions generally about these kinds of things are very retarded, although he does great work. I think the idea of not voting your conscience and this idea of voting for the lesser evil, I think it has to be done away with the Muslim community in general, but specifically in the West, I think. And I mean, not to play devil's advocate further for them, it's not just political organization. I think social and civil organization is also very important, which I think the American Muslims have not done as effectively as European Muslims have. And not to blame them, but I think they need to galvanize. And I think I think a lot of them are still in fear of that post 9/11 sort of war on terror kind of, because you see a lot of the bigger du'at and shuyukh, they're still under the sort of the shadow of the 9/11 attacks and the unfortunate aftermath of domestic surveillance. with the MSAs, the Masajid, the ISOCs. They were all being monitored in the UK and the US. I think it was scarier in the US for the Muslim community, and a lot of the older shuyukh and duat are now holding influence over a lot of institutions and academic and positions of academe, where they're influencing the younger people to not, galvanize with third-party options. I think the default of the Democratic Party is still there.
I think that's true, but I think I suffer from this as well as outsiders, and I am an outsider, and so American Muslims have a right to say, I don't have my finger on the pulse. Although, as you know, I speak regularly to American Muslims, and Sami Hamdi, who's now become a de facto American because he spends most of his time in America than Britain, as you know. But when I speak to American Muslims, I am actually, it's amazing to see how they've moved on. If they haven't, often what we do is we mischaracterize Western Muslims by looking at leaderships or by surveying what the media portrays of the values and the attitudes of American Muslims. And that's not always the case. It's not always true what they depict. When you speak to ordinary Americans, and I've tried my best in this last month or 2 months to speak to American Muslims from all stratas of society, Black Americans, Americans who migrated many years ago, new entrants into America, young Americans in particular. And Gaza, I think, has been a galvanizing force, and it's really pushed American Muslims to make critical decisions about their fate and their position in American society. So I'm actually very happy and to see to observe American Muslims and their attitudes today, and particularly young Muslims. I mean, on the Thinking Muslim podcast, we have a team, and a number of our team members are young Muslims from America, and they're eloquent, and their ability to cut through the propaganda of the American state, I think I'm heartened by it. So often we are fooled into believing that attitudes in X country are we do the same for Pakistan, right? We from afar, Muslims in Britain, we formulate some views about Pakistani Muslims, which are actually inaccurate. But it's only when we speak to brothers like you.
No, it's much worse.
We get a greater picture.
It's always much worse. It's always much worse in Pakistan.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. No.
I leave that to you. Yes.
I think it's a fair assessment of the situation, that we might be reading too much into the war on terror narrative, and that I think a lot of young people, it's simply gone. They have a collective amnesia for that time, and they're in the here and now, and Gaza is a big deal for them, and they're not willing to let go of that, which would allow the young people in your team, inshallah, and others to be able to cut through the propaganda, through the BS, as we would say, without having any fear of being marginalized in America, or not being as American as the other Americans. Because again, the left does provide some comfort in that there is somebody critiquing the military. And you saw it also in this weird sort of alt-right formation in America, where the alt-right was also critical of the military apparatus and the warring foreign policy. And I think the internet has allowed young people to find comfort in these pockets where they're able to have support systems and be able to cut through the propaganda of the American state. And I think it's unfair the way I characterize them. I take back my words, and I agree with you. I think that young people, inshallah, will not be subject to war on terror thinking and cable news thinking. I think cable news era is well beyond us now, is well behind us now.
Yeah.
Speaking of cable news and the effects it has had on the addled minds of boomers like yourself and I. We're not boomers. What are we called? We're millennials, right? We're one of them. We're not Gen Z, at least. Do you think that, clearly you launched this platform with something in mind, Yani, of achieving certain goals within the Western Muslim community, as well as and have a broader impact on Western society. Did you find that it was effective as a tool in the elections and organizing And what do you think you started to achieve, mashallah, with the platform and shifting from audio to video?
Yeah, Barakallah Feek. Thank you for asking me about that. As you notice, I mean, you're very well known platform in Pakistan, or growing platform in Pakistan. I can see your face, your expression there. But I think, as you know, that alhamdulillah, when you do something for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you seek Allah's barakah in your activities, and you wish that your work bears fruit. Actually, let me step back and explain what made me do the podcast in the first place. So I used to belong to an organization here that did a lot of da'wah and activity, and I got jaded by that. And as you know, organizations come with their good, but also come with their bad, as you know. And after a while, you start to talk to yourself. So you may have 500, 1,000 people, but they're all talking to one another and not talking to the people outside. But you feel, after a while, like you're doing something, although you're not doing very much, right? So I left that, and I spent a number of years thinking to myself, okay, what am I going to do? I can't just stand still. I feel that I've gained some experience and some knowledge. How do I leverage that for the sake of our ummah, and how do I contribute to this ummah so I can go to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with at least something on my scales and ask for Allah's mercy? So I used to make this dua, Aman Allah Bay, which and the dua was asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give me a guidance better than how I'm guided today, and to allow me to access people who are going to help me on this journey. Give me resource, give me people, right? And this is a Quranic dua that I used to make this regularly when I used to pray, and alhamdulillah, then I tried many things, and I came to the idea that starting a podcast may be a worthwhile activity. And so I began the podcast, and subhanallah, as you know, when you start something and it's worthwhile, people come around you and people begin to contribute and people begin to take ownership over it. So I can honestly say that the team we have today, they see it as their activity and their project, and they really contribute and find it a nourishing thing to be part of this activity. We set 2 or 3 objectives when we began the podcast. Essentially what we wanted to do is raise the level of thinking, because we felt that what was available in the English-speaking medium on social media in particular, coming here from the West, was often quite superficial. And I suspect you know that. When we look at, I'm sure there is a market for that. And alhamdulillah, there's a lot of good done through many of these platforms, but it sometimes dumbs down the great sort of intellectual depth of Islam and reduces it to sound bites. And every single program seems to be on marriage and divorce, rather than the burning issues, the debt crisis in Pakistan, or the genocide in Gaza. These things seem to be on the peripheries of our thinking. So I started a podcast believing that there are some amazing quality experts within the Muslim communities here in the West, but these people are not platformed. Instead, the guys who are platformed are the guys who can do stunts, who can contribute to a superficiality of the ummah. I mean, talking about stereotypes, I suspect you guys think that British Muslims are of one particular type, right? Because that's all on social media, we dominate with this quite naive, and I am going to be strong here and say it's a naive sort of quality.
We're not all Modine. I thought you were all Modine.
I won't even profess to know what know what you said.
Or weren't you all like man like Mubin? Sorry, I called him Modine.
Man like Mubin. Yes.
Aren't you all just man like Mubin then?
Yeah. But it's not. This is the. We talked. At the beginning we spoke about the split screen moment of this offer. Right. I used to see that. I used to go to events in the university and in the community, and I would see really amazing quality people who are contributing to raising the thinking of the Muslim community. But I wouldn't see that necessarily. And then on
TV, you see on TV, Abu Azam al-Britani, right?
And it's odd. For example, there's a mosque in Woolwich in the UK, and I'm not exaggerating. Every day, they have one or two conversions to Islam. In Ramadan, subhanallah, there will be in one Ramadan, if I remember right, they had 60, 70 non-Muslims who became Muslim just in that 1 month, right? Because of the outreach activities and the work that the imams do in the community, and the community does, actually young people do in the community. It's phenomenal what you see. And actually, if you follow Lewisham Mosque, if you follow their YouTube channel or their Twitter account, you'll get like 10 likes for their activity. Yet that's what's actually happening here in the UK. There's this phenomenal work taking place, but it's never really highlighted on social media because it's not seen to be the work that gets you 100,000 likes, right? Because it's not stunty and superficial. Anyway, back to my motivation. The motivation was to raise the level of thinking within the Muslim community, but at the same time, to build what we termed enlightened activism. Often what you get is a lot of thinkers, but the thinkers don't translate their thinking into practical work. And so we wanted to build and develop a community that does the thinking, but also engages in good quality activism and good quality activity. And alhamdulillah, I think we've had a mixture of guests who are able to convey this duality, this idea of thinking and producing good quality work. And we saw that in particular over GULZAR. I think, alhamdulillah, the Thinking Muslim and other podcast platforms contributed quite heavily in creating this consciousness amongst Muslims that we've got to get involved and we've got to do work and we've got to have activity within our Muslim communities that raise the bar. And I saw phenomenal work, in this last year from within the Muslim community, especially amongst young Muslims.
We started this thing in English because of the Thinking Muslim, and we've seen a lot of the work you've done. You've highlighted people that I'd never heard of before. MashaAllah. And it was an introduction to a lot of, not just people to learn from, but also guests for our podcast. We would be like, oh, this guy looks kind of, Yeah. I mean,
I'm doing the same with your podcast, by the way. I'm taking lots of guest names from you. So it's a two-way process.
I suspect that's not as true as from our side, but not to say that you're not being truthful. I think you're just being kind. But so there was an element. Okay, so this is what I've understood from your decision to make this platform. You became jaded. Obviously, you had the full 4 Lions experience, and you
not quite,
mashallah. Never the full 4 Lions experience. Which, by the way, just on a side note, I thought it was a fairly fun depiction of a particular kind of British Muslim. It wasn't the fairest.
I've never watched The 4 Lions. I've never watched it.
I would highly recommend it. Not to your audience. They might hate me for this, but it's very entertaining. Definitely, that's what I'll say about it. I don't think it's a fair
I've seen
depiction.
many clips. Yeah.
They always hit. Abu Azam al-Brittani is a character from that. That was what I was mentioning. He's the white convert who was like a nut job. Anyways, I'm so sorry. So one element of your desire to make the platform is to have better media representation for real Muslims who are doing real important work. They're not gimmicky. They're not one-trick ponies who are good for the Piers Morgan show, for example. They're actually sustainably doing something for the ummah and the community. And the other element, I suspect, was to intellectualize the discourse, which you mentioned earlier, that you felt that the English-speaking discourse in the ummah was very basic. And I know what you're referring to, the kind of the archetypical sort of reel from a marriage khutbah or something that you get the short. And it is a changing landscape, inshallah, I think. What about other kinds of media depiction? I mean, I've seen that Muhammad Hijab has tried some stuff with, making like short films and dramas, and because that is one thing that we should have expected more from Western Muslims. Me personally, I think that with the media apparatus and the media production apparatus being centered in the West, one would have assumed there would have been more of an export of Muslim-centered media. Yani, like at the quality of, let's say, or the caliber of an Irani film. If you've ever seen Iranian film, it's very high caliber, high quality film. Has there been a move towards more media representation for Muslims by Muslims? Yani creating content and even for pure entertainment purposes, not just entirely educational.
Yeah.
Has there been a push for that, or no? You think it's too premature considering the state of affairs in the Ummah?
No, I think there has been a push. I think we're seeing we're seeing some of that, and again, Gaza has been a lightning rod for so many communities in the West, and there is a movement to produce our own media and to produce our own content. You know, we I suppose are in the knowledge space, and you know, that's where the thinking Muslim resides. But of course, there are tech entrepreneurs who are developing platforms from a tech perspective that can help the Muslim community and collectives being formed there. And I can see in the cultural space, the green shoots are developing, especially in countries like Britain and America. So I see some of that happening. But of course, you know, there is an expectation that this comes from the West, and often, you know, it's not the West that is that and Western Muslims that are producing the best output. I mean, just think about the impact, for good or ill, but the impact of Electoral and how that's impacted not just us, but you guys in Pakistan. I mean, I've seen Pakistani Muslims with wedding ceremonies that are fully fitted in Electoral outfits. That's how much you have culture. But in a very serious way, it has raised this ummatic consciousness amongst Muslims around the world that, you know, we do have a history, we have a civilization, and that civilization binds us all together as Muslims as far afield as Indonesia, and Muslims in Africa, and Muslims in the West. And there is much more that connects us than divides us as Muslims. But I agree that Western Muslims probably, because we have the tools available to us to improve our game and produce better quality output, not just in the news space or in sort of the idea space, but also in the cultural space. And that's a challenge I believe we've got to adopt.
And speaking of Electoral and the cultural impact that he's had on the collective subconscious of the Pakistani Muslim community and the wedding culture, I mean, he was successfully able to defeat all of Western civilization in I think a span of 300 to 400 episodes. Do you think Western civilization or the notion of the West is now under question as being, you know, Europe being a garden surrounded by savages, as one of your MPs in European Parliament put it? Is Electoral banging at the gates of the Mediterranean again? Maybe ideologically and intellectually as opposed to militarily this time?
Manala, I'm taking notes because I'm really impressed in your ability to segue between questions. By the way, it's amazing to see. But yes, it was Joseph Borrell, the High Commissioner for Foreign Affairs of the European Parliament, who compared, you know, the Europeans to I think it was a garden, and outside it was a jungle, right? And this sort of notion that it's that dehumanizing notion that everyone outside is, you know, are savages, and, you know, we're the civilizing West, and we have this paradise. If you go to the streets of Paris and London, sometimes you would find that paradise to be quite elusive, I have to say. But at least that's what they claim.
You can smell it sometimes. Yeah, I've been to Paris. You can smell it.
You can. You go to the subway in Paris. It's atrocious, I have to say. I mean,
but then they would turn back and say that's the immigrants. But I suspect it's not.
No, you know, that khair inshallah. I mean, that's, you know, they would say that because they blame everything on immigrants, of course. But let's come back to the substantive point about, you know, the West and whether it can be defeated. I think Gaza has contributed to the defeat of the idea of the West. And I think I want to be very careful with my language here, because, of course, the West and its exceptionalism is built upon these fundamental liberal principles. I mean, Joseph Borrell, who made that comment, was really talking to this liberal world order that they somehow created after the Second World War, this post-World War rules-based order, which for the first time they claim created this level playing field in the world where all countries were equal and law-guided states would rule international relations. If you remember, Francis Fukuyama back in the 1990s talked about the end of history, this so-called romanticized notion of how the world had moved beyond war and there will be perpetual peace in the world. Now, that idea of the liberal world order, America has created what is being called the liberal Leviathan by John Eikenberry. This idea of how the world is now in a better stage because of American power. That romanticized notion of American power has burst. And not only Muslims, but I think even non-Muslims today recognize just the brutality of Western foreign policy and the brutality of this order. And I feel that the idea of the West, this liberal notion that the West is somehow superior, is they are dismantling it one by one. It's not just Gaza that has done that, but Gaza has highlighted that you could have this genocide take place where large numbers of people are murdered, yet the West finds it very difficult to even recognize the humanity of these people, let alone do anything against that, right? And let alone develop policies, but it will stop and restrain Israel. And that hypocrisy is so obvious to see. But I think that it's not just a hypocrisy of Netanyahu or a hypocrisy of Biden or hypocrisy of Starmer or whoever it may be. It's a deeper realization, but the West as an idea is not fit to be a civilizational idea in when it comes to international relations. And I wish and hope, and I think it's happening. I believe that we are seeing the slow erosion of the West as an idea, and a lot of its pretenses to civility is now eroding in front of our eyes. This, the Wizard of Oz. The West is the Wizard of Oz. When you take away the curtain, you find that there is this meek, horrid ideology that really is no different to any of the colonial missions that the world has seen for centuries, right? It's a brutal empire, and its pretenses to anything that we can claim to be higher order, it's only that, it's a pretense. So now, as I said earlier on, do we have do we as Muslims, can we contribute to that debate that the left are involved in, and even some members of the right are now involved in? Of course, as you quite rightly mentioned, the alt-right in America, there is this post-liberalism, which actually comes from the alt-right strand of America rather than from the left, right? Where many on the right are now envisaging an America that was pre-American Constitution, that was pre-liberalism. So are we at a state where that debate is already taking place in Western society, and we can contribute to that? Why not? We should be contributing, and we should find a space for how we can articulate the cause of Islam and the cause of Muslims within this debate that is raging in Western societies, and it's going to rage moving forward for the next few decades in the West.
No, I think that the romantic notion of the end of history and the rules-based world order not just being a mouthful, it's also been shoved down our throats because,
yes.
And I think the war on terror was the most particularly gross iteration of this end of history narrative, where we were being quite literally ended for history to end. Yani, this idea that you could slaughter a majority of the Muslims into submission, and then they would Arabs, Muslims, whatever you want to call us, and then that we would somehow capitulate to this logical conclusion that has come to how every nation will be specialized in their own way, and then trade will flourish, and there will be no more wars. I think the Liberal World Project has failed. I think Gaza has been the trailer or the beginning of the end for the actual film. And I think it's very beautifully put that, do we have something to contribute to this debate? Do we have something to add? Do we have our own space, right? Do we need to create it? Do we need to... and then what does that mean for the Muslim world? Because the idea of Western Muslims having somewhere to immigrate to eventually, it is an unanswered question, even that, in that what will the Muslim world look like in the next 50 to 100 years? And so I think it brings us to, the greater question is that, do we add as citizens of the Western world, in your case and your colleagues' case, or do we add as Muslims who happen to be in the Western world?
I think the latter, and I think that a good example, a practical example of that is, this very clearly. We have hundreds of students from Pakistan who come to Britain every year. They study at places like LSE, and they learn about Keynesian or neoliberal economics, and they go back to Pakistan and they ruin the country for another generation, I'm sorry to say. And so what you have here is you've got knowledge developed here in the West, which propagandize, which nourishes in a negative way Muslims, for young Muslims, impressionable Muslims maybe from the Muslim world, who go back and they find a stronger affinity with Keynes and with Friedman and with Haeckel. And they commit themselves to another series of IMF loans, which are no doubt going to handicap the country and disable the country for yet another generation. Yet they believe, because they're and they don't even understand these ideas very deeply, but because they're parroting these economic precepts, that somehow that will be the magic solution. If only they tried again, even though the generations beforehand have tried the same bitter pill, maybe Pakistan or Bangladesh or Malaysia or whatever, these countries will improve. I think that we have a responsibility in the West insofar as there is this, there has to be this cross-pollination, this connection between the ummah, that we have to start generating new ideas. We have to start generating critiques of modernity, critiques of Western liberalism, critiques of Western economic philosophy, which I know that, alhamdulillah, many people in Pakistan are now embracing and adopting, so that we develop a space for our own solutions, which are authentically Muslim and Islamic, and authentically
and
come
not just
from
Islamic economics, not
exactly. And platforms like yours and platforms like mine have opened up that space where we can give people that ability to speak about these issues in a serious way. Alhamdulillah.
Yeah, no, the thinking Muslim can definitely facilitate people speaking about these issues in a serious way. I think I understand what you mean, in that there's a lack of originality when it comes to a lot of Muslim intellectual input in these conversations, because it's always a repeat of something that we've learned in liberal arts colleges in the Western world. And then you have that sort of revolving door of, one more loan, one more, economics student, one more loan, and, and they're placed in some think tank or in some big policy group in Pakistan, where the government is like, yes, so-and-so came from Cambridge or such and such came from Princeton, and they know exactly what we need to do. It's another loan. It's obviously not so innocent as just that we don't know any better. It's also, it's a bit more nefarious than that. Yes. But I do understand the core of your argument, in that we need to create our own ideas about the way the economy should be organized, the way society should be organized. And the only way to do that is to start with critiquing modernity and to critique existing ideas. And that will produce some more original thinking. And this is, again, a generational project, inshallah. Platforms like yourself would it would be 20, 30 years of work that would then produce something worth presenting to the world, inshallah. But even in the here and now, we do have an increasing amount of originality coming out of the Muslim world because of English. surprisingly, because English is the lingua franca now amongst the Muslim world. It's allowing a lot of original thought that was not seen before, I think, because of language barriers now being presented. And there's a lot of work being done in the West and as well as in the East in the Muslim world. But I think that you're right that the Western Muslims enjoying the privileges of the West have to act as the sort of the tip of the spear with regards to Islam in the Muslim world, because they, for example, just freedom of speech and expression is one of those privileges that they can then, reallocate that to, to servicing or being the voice for the Muslim world where they will not be able to express themselves. I mean, there's a very nice joke that an uncle here tells me every time I meet him, every single time. He says that in the Arab world, you can only open your mouth in front of your dentist. And he always has a big laugh about it, because Pakistan does enjoy a significant amount of free speech compared to the Gulf states, I think, the Arab regimes. Sure. But I think the Western Muslims can do that for us in a way that maybe we cannot. And I think an increased liaison and communication would be the way forward. I mean, and since you're in the work of sort of, I guess, media presentation and dealing with academics, do you have any insights into where the war is going? I mean, I don't expect punditry, but what do you think is going to become of the conflict? Because a lot of the audience is always, the only curiosity is that they want the guests to make a prediction about what they think is how this thing will turn out, because I think that's all everyone cares about these days, which I think is good.
Yeah, I think I can give you some very basic thoughts of mine about this matter. When we think about Israel's war, of course, Israel is out of control, and what it's doing now in Gaza is no more than ethnically cleansing Gaza of Palestinians, and its bloodlust really for Palestinian lives now sees no restriction. And of course, at the time of the U.S. election, it enables the Israeli state to prosecute its genocide with greater intensity. And of course, it's widened its conflict now to Lebanon, and there are rumors, and it's not just rumors, but there's speculation that in the next few days there will mount an attack on Iran, and there's a conversation, in fact, today between of this to countries, surrounding countries, and at the moment there are very few constraints on Israeli power beyond the superficial conversations that are being had between the American establishment and Israel. In fact, many would argue that far from being constraints, the Americans have now seen an opportunity. Fair enough, maybe Netanyahu acted in a very rash way, if we were to follow at least the American narrative, but acted in a very rash way when it came to taking on Hezbollah in Lebanon and bombing Beirut. But the speed at which was able to destabilize Hezbollah in Lebanon has maybe given American policymakers some room to believe that there is an opportunity now to reconfigure, in inverted commas, the Middle East. So I think we're at a very dangerous time. And yes, of course,
I think it's a similar delusion with like Russia and Ukraine, where they think that Russia has the potential to be destabilized by the Ukraine. It's a similar sort of delusion.
Yes, although I must say, and I don't want to end with a pessimistic note, but of course, Ukraine being the weaker party here, is being helped by and aided by all of the Western powers, right? The Palestinians are not being aided by anyone. Palestinians and the Lebanese, and we are alone. And in fact, the Muslim countries have deserted Palestine and deserted.
You misunderstood my analogy. I said that the Ukraine is analogous to Israel in the sense that they see Ukraine potentially redefining Russian boundaries and territories. That, they think that Israel might be effective in redefining territories and geography and national boundaries in the Middle East in that sense.
Yeah, I think that's very, very possible. But again, the analogy is a very apt analogy. And when it comes from the Western perspective, there are certainly Republicans, if not some hawks within the democratic establishment, who now see that, like they did back in 2003 when they invaded Iraq, right? So there is always this very superficial understanding and appreciation of the Middle East and the Muslim world in general. In the American establishment, that naivety has not gone away. It seems you just have to read some of the articles coming out of Foreign Affairs Journal when you realize that this naivety remains pretty visceral in the American political makeup. But I think there is this sort of this unbridled belief that potentially Israel can redefine the borders and redefine some of the power structures in the Middle East. I think where that analogy potentially falls short is that the Russians, of course, do have power and they do have some leverage and they do have some support. The problem we've got in the Muslim world is none of the Muslim states, especially those in the Arab and in the epicenter of this crisis, none of the Muslim states are willing to do anything about Israeli power. In fact, the speculation is that the Gulf states in particular, who have spent the last couple of years engaging in rapprochement with Iran because of Iran's meddling in places like Syria and Iraq, they've now seen an opportunity for Israel to clip the wings of its adversary in the Middle East. So in fact, what we have here is we've got Gulf states probably, at the very least, turning a blind eye to Israeli action in Lebanon and Iran. And so our countries conspire with the enemy to weaken one another, whereas, the analogy about Russia, of course, is that Russia does still have allies like China and others who are willing to help it. So I think it's a very dangerous time. And I would like to say, by the way, that at least intellectually, Gaza has given us a lot of hope. And at least from an Imani perspective, has given us a lot of hope in terms of just the sheer bravery of our brothers and sisters in Gaza. And so that seed has been planted. But I think in the short to medium term, we're not going to see, unless, of course, a change happens in the Muslim ummah and in the Muslim countries, we're not going to see the types of victories, in inverted commas, that we hope we would see for now, because Israel has the collective might of the West behind it. And it's got battleship carriers who are ready to defend it to the very death. And it's got 50,000 American troops now that are stationed in the region. And it's got a plethora of American firepower to rely upon. And even if Netanyahu is regarded by Biden to be a problem and a thorn in his side, which probably Netanyahu is. I mean, I think it's fair to say that there's Bob Woodward, who's a veteran commentator on all things presidential, who commented that for the last 6 weeks, Biden and Netanyahu haven't actually spoken until maybe this conversation today. Even though Netanyahu may be a thorn in the side and may act in a very rogue way, the state of Israel as a venture, as a colonial enterprise, is just too precious for America to ever abandon. And as we know, the way the world works, if you're going to confront a military hegemon like America, you've got to have at least equal the power of America. And China maybe is probably the only state in the world at the moment that has that ability, or at least is developing that ability to do so. Whereas the Muslim world, it's not because of the lack of ability. We have ability and talent and resources. We just don't have the political will at the moment to do that. And so this is a very long way to say that I'm not very hopeful militarily that we're going to come to the aid of our brothers and sisters in Gaza. But I'm very hopeful from a sort of more broader intellectual perspective that Gaza has planted amazing seeds in the Muslim Ummah, which inevitably is going to, and so to simplify in a way, but is going to create the generation that will create the Salahuddins and the Ertugrals and the types of the Muhammad bin Qasims, the types of figures we require collectively to bring a more equal solution for the Muslim world.
No, that was very beautifully put, Jalal bhai. Thank you for your time today, and inshallah, hopefully, your audience will not hate me too much.
Not at all.
It was very nice speaking with you, inshallah. And now I'm gonna give you a chance to give a closing message if you'd like. Something you want to talk about, plug, whatever. How can people contact you?
No, I have nothing to plug. You can obviously watch my podcast, which you've plugged, alhamdulillah, in a disproportionate way, I have to say, on your podcast,
really
and I'm very grateful for that. But no, I think I would like to be invited to Lahore. I mean, this would be the height of honor to do that. As you know, I have been to Karachi, and I love the city, but it would be wonderful to have a cup of tea with you, a cup of chai with you in Lahore sometime.
When coming to Lahore, chai is not the option. It's donkey meat. That's the joke. I don't know if you're aware of it, but anyways, it's a long story. Inshallah, we'll try to arrange these tours, and I would love for you to visit most of Pakistan, not just Lahore.
Yeah, I would love to.
Inshallah, we'll see you soon. I'm gonna stop the thing now.
Barakallah feek.